Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 24 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the Colorado Avalanche and lost by a score of 6-0. And you'll notice that this review is substantially shorter than what I usually have here, kind of similar to the one a couple of weeks ago after the game against the Calgary Flames, but I'll actually be taking a little bit of a different slant for this particular game. After the one against Calgary, because that was one against the worst team in the entire NHL, where the Sharks shot themselves in the foot constantly, had a ton of unforced errors, and basically beat themselves, I was a lot more negative about that game. Here tonight, it's not as though that I'm going to be like, yeah, the Sharks played fantastically, but I am a lot more understanding of the situation here. The Sharks, they come in and they just get absolutely dismantled by the Colorado Avalanche. From minute 1 to minute 60, the Avs are just significantly better, but you were kind of expecting such a result. The deck was sort of stacked against the Sharks coming into this one for a multitude of reasons. First of all, the Sharks are on the road. They don't get to find the same matchups that they were looking for in actually the first matchup between these two teams this season. And on top of that, being in Colorado, the altitude does play a factor, but also Colorado is the team that finds themselves right at the top of the NHL standings. There's been a ton of clustering in the standings this season. Teams are very, very close together. Usually by Thanksgiving, you kind of have a decent picture of what the playoffs are going to look like and which teams are going to make it and which teams are going to miss out, give or take a couple. But this time around, you can't even really make much of a clear prediction. A team could go on a 3 or 4 game winning streak and suddenly find themselves right at the top of their division, just as they can go on a 3 or 4 game losing streak and be in like a lottery position, right? But the Colorado Avalanche, they floated to the top. They're on a current now 10-game winning streak here, far and away the best team, the Stanley Cup favorites here as much as you can be, just about a quarter of the way into the season. And so San Jose, definitely at a massive disadvantage, but usually what you kind of have in your back pocket as the underdog in these types of matchups is that maybe Colorado will come in and kind of underestimate the Sharks and that the Sharks can strike and take advantage of that opportunity. But the thing is that these teams have already played this year, and that was actually the last game that the Avalanche have lost this season. Before this now 10-game winning streak, they lost a game to the Sharks in San Jose. And so they're kind of looking for some revenge coming into this one, right? They look at a team that has taken advantage of them in their first matchup here, and now they're saying, like, we want to be able to actually show that we're not just going to lose to the San Jose Sharks twice this season. And on top of all of these factors, one other thing is that while the Avalanche have been winning a lot recently, their last couple of games haven't actually been as clean as they would like. They had 1-0 victory over the Chicago Blackhawks and essentially a 1-0 victory over the Nashville Predators, two teams that aren't necessarily all that great. And so they also want to redeem themselves with a stronger outing here. All of these factors, all of these reasons working against the San Jose Sharks tonight. And so while I was obviously hoping for San Jose to overcome this situation and manage to pick up a victory here, sneak one out, I was not really remotely surprised when the Avalanche came in and just simply dominated the San Jose Sharks as they did. I also want to mention one other factor, because some people might look at this, as I said, pretty negatively and say, well, this was a wake-up call for the San Jose Sharks, the sobering reality that they're actually not a very good team. But I think that's kind of an unfair way of looking at this. Like, it is quite clear that the Avalanche are not just a step or a couple of steps above the San Jose Sharks. They are 10 steps above them and multiple steps above pretty much every single team in the NHL. They should not be the measuring stick that the San Jose Sharks look at to where they are in this particular season, right? Right now, their kind of like highest possible kind of opportunity to finish out this year is to sneak into like a wild card spot. That's basically like the highest moment that they can hit this season as a group. And to do that, they're not going to be fighting in the standings with the Avalanche, who have pretty much already secured number 1 in the Central Division. They're going to be fighting with teams like the Utah Mammoth or the Los Angeles Kings, two teams that the Sharks were actually able to beat on their most recent homestand just last week. That's really the kind of measuring stick opponents that you want to be matching the San Jose Sharks up with, and those are the teams that they're able to actually claim some victories against. And so them losing to the Colorado Avalanche, them getting completely destroyed by the Colorado Avalanche, it's obviously not a good thing, but over a dozen other teams have also had this happen to them in some way or another this season. So the Sharks are not alone in that factor. The fact is just that the Avalanche are a outstanding team that is gunning for a Stanley Cup this season, and the Sharks are not. When it comes to how this one ends up playing out, first period, couple goals there put up by Colorado, Colton, and then it is McKinnon on the power play to make it 2-0. The Sharks were actually quite fortunate to only be down a couple of goals after those first 20 minutes, thanks to some great goaltending as usual from Askarov. However, in the second period, that was really where it was put away. The Avalanche grabbed 3 goals within about a 75-second time span to turn a 2-0 game that the Sharks could have theoretically made a comeback in to now a 5-0 game where it was pretty much just over right then and there. But I do want to give some credit to the San Jose Sharks for actually not giving up in this one. It would have been very easy down 5-0 to just sort of throw in the towel and not really try much and just let this game play out the final 30 or so minutes of it. But the Sharks, they actually came back, they pushed a little bit, they got some chances. They probably could have had at least a couple of goals here, if not for their former goaltender Mackenzie Blackwood kind of stonewalling them throughout this one. And so it remained a 5-0 game after 40 minutes. Third period, they added another one, didn't really matter, and so it was a 6-0 final score. Moving on to the players to talk about, like I mentioned, not going to mention every single player here. Just note that pretty much everybody got beat out in their minutes tonight. It's not as though there were tons and tons of individual mistakes that you can highlight, but it's just when they were on the ice, they were overwhelmed by whichever line, whichever defensive pairings that the Avalanche had actually thrown over the boards. And so me sitting here and talking about how Tyler Toffoli had his 20th ineffectual game of the season, that doesn't really provide much. So I'll highlight just a couple of guys who I thought at least had somewhat interesting nights here. I'll start off with the 2 young players on the Sharks first line, Celebrini and Smith. Now I do want to say these duo of players, in fact the entire first line, they do not escape any criticisms here tonight. They were quite bad, especially in the early parts of this game. That first period, they could do nothing, and while they didn't find themselves always on the ice against McKinnon, when they did, they were just getting absolutely outplayed. Like, there's not a ton of positives that you can pull out, but what I will say is as we did get to the second period, for these younger players where this might be a very much a demotivating type of game, I liked that they kind of stuck with it. They looked to get some chances. Smith had like 3 or 4 really good opportunities on net. The same goes for Celebrini. On the power play, they actually had some solid looks, despite the fact that the Sharks went 0 for 4 on that tonight. And so I'll give them at least a little bit of credit in a game where they did not play well whatsoever. They still managed to find some offensive looks, which I think is important for these 2 players who are already basically the 2 top players offensively for the San Jose Sharks, and they will continue to be that as they develop into the future over the next few years. The other next player who I want to talk about is actually on the Sharks' third line here with Colin Graf. Now, Graf is not the type of player who's going to be able to have a massive, noticeable impact on every single game that you play, right? The real kind of players who are going to be able to have like a noted type of effect on whether the Sharks win a game or they lose a game, that you're looking at more so the goaltender like Askarov or like the really, really high skilled players like Macklin Celebrini. Colin Graf is the type of guy who you toss onto your team to take a team that is 90% of the way there and put them over the top, to get them into a position where they're not just winning a round or 2 in the playoffs, but that they can actually compete for a Stanley Cup. He is that type of complementary piece that really gets you over the finish line. For instance, you take a look at the Florida Panthers, who have now won back-to-back Stanley Cups. You look at a guy like Anton Lundell, for instance, who was the third-line center for the Florida Panthers this past season. If you ask anyone on Florida, they will mention how Lundell is a huge, important piece of their roster, key in terms of shutting down other teams' top players, being really good defensively and chipping in offensively. But the thing is that he's not some sort of transformational talent. If you were to take Anton Lundell and put him on the Nashville Predators, they probably still remain a bottom 3 or bottom 5 team in the NHL, compared to if you were to take like a Matthew Tkachuk or a Sam Reinhart and put them in a similar position, because they have that offensive ability to really turn a game on its head. That's the position that kind of Colin Graf is in, where he can be the really important player for your group when you're getting deep into a playoff run, not necessarily the guy who you're looking at to win games for you single-handedly in the regular season. And so right now, it might not feel as though he's like this vastly important player for the San Jose Sharks, because there are other major pieces that are still missing on this team. But in a couple of years' time, especially as he continues to hone that defensive game, he made some great defensive plays 5-on-5 and on the penalty kill in this one. As he continues to get better, and as the Sharks get to more of a position where they're not just a ragtag group of players looking to upset teams, but are actually not just competing for a playoff spot, but competing for playoff victories and round victories in the postseason, Colin Graf is going to be one of those guys you look towards as being a clutch player who actually does get you like an overtime goal or just like a key defensive play to keep a 1-goal lead alive, things like that. So Graf still extremely important for the San Jose Sharks' future, despite the fact that he might not appear on the scoreboard as often as others. When it comes to his line mate, who I also want to mention here, Ty Dellandrea, I've already talked about multiple times that Dellandrea isn't really a third liner. That thought hasn't necessarily changed. There isn't enough offense consistently from this player, but what we have been able to see is some really nice flashes of plays coming out from Dellandrea. In the game against the Boston Bruins, he had that great move on the rush, entering the zone that ends up drawing a penalty. Here tonight, there was one where he's in the Avalanche zone and then just cuts like in the corner of the Avalanche zone and then just immediately takes the space that's available to him, cuts to the net and gets a good chance onto Blackwood. That's something you would have never seen from Ty Dellandrea this past season, and so he's been more effective. It's nice to see him actually be able to turn that around, and so he has been a somewhat enjoyable player to actually watch as of late in this season for the Sharks. Besides these two, not really much else to mention on the forward side of things. So moving on to the blue line, the big thing I guess you can take away from this is probably the fact that Klingberg and Leddy are likely watching this game from the press box and rubbing their hands together like, yes, now it's our time to find our way back into the lineup. As unfortunate as that is, it's kind of the same as was the case a couple of weeks ago when the Sharks did play Calgary. But the difference being is that after that Flames game, I was not surprised to see the Sharks make defensive changes, but I also didn't disagree with it either. After tonight, I'd like to see the Sharks actually stick with the same 6 players because, like I had said earlier on, it's not as though this team was making tons and tons of individual mistakes. It's just that these 6 defensemen were simply overwhelmed in their own zone and just losing matchups constantly to the Avalanche players. And the thing is that I don't think if Klingberg and Leddy had played in this game over, let's say, Mukhamadullin and Liljegren or whatever the case may be, that would have made any difference whatsoever. And so I'd still rather the Sharks stick with the 6 defensemen who I think are the best 6 defensemen that the Sharks can actually ice on any given night, especially when you consider the fact that if Warsofsky was to make any changes, you're likely looking more so at guys like Dickinson and Mukhamadullin, as has been the case this season. And if I look at both of those players, I think obviously they were bad, like everyone was bad this game, but amongst the defensemen, they actually had some of the better games. And I want to highlight Dickinson in particular because, as I said, there were mistakes. He is the one who makes the error that leads to this Ross Colton goal. There were some poor decisions early on as well that made me think we were trending more so towards like the game we saw him play against the Los Angeles Kings last week. But I thought Dickinson got to a very important crossroads in this game and actually ended up making a really interesting decision because as a defenseman, in a game where you're losing this badly, you have 2 different ways you can go, right? One is to just try to hunker down, not try to do too much, chip pucks off the glass and wait for the time to run out and say like, hey, I don't want to make any more big mistakes. I don't want to give up any more goals when I'm on the ice. And so I'll just play it safely and hope that the clock runs out and we can move on to next game. But the other decision that you can take is, hey, we're down 4 goals, we're down 5 goals. Let me just try and do something here if I could be the catalyst that gets this game going in the other direction. And that's really where Dickinson went. He was trying to contribute offensively. Everybody was terrible defensively. There's no exception to that. But offensively, Dickinson, I thought, was the most effective defenseman for the San Jose Sharks. A couple of times he actually got some really high danger opportunities. He had like a pseudo breakaway off of a nice setup from Smith and Celebrini. They got him a good look onto Blackwood. He had another chance where he comes in there on the back door but is unable to put it home. And so I really liked the confidence that Sam Dickinson was showing, which is another reason for why I want him to remain in the lineup going into the next game. The Sharks matchup next on Friday is against the Vancouver Canucks, a team that is significantly more their speed, much more their level. And so how could he look playing against a team like that with the confidence that he showed here tonight at times against Colorado is what I'm very interested in seeing. When it comes to Mukhamadullin, from an offensive perspective, a little bit more muted, but he actually did have some very effective shifts, in particular in the first period. Probably was on the ice for like 2 of the only good shifts that the Sharks had in the opening 20 minutes of this game. Actually had some ability to assert himself offensively and to move the puck decently well in some of those moments. So again, defensive errors, of course, across the board here, but those 2 young defensemen I thought had some bright spots to actually hang your hat on. And then finally, it comes to the Sharks goaltenders, Askarov and Nedeljkovic. You could say, well, maybe the Sharks shouldn't have had Askarov here tonight because of all the factors that I mentioned earlier on. Give Nedeljkovic Nedeljkovic the night and have Askarov not really ruin his confidence. But the thing is that for myself, coming into these games, I could come in with the perspective of like, hey, the Sharks are probably going to lose this one, but you don't want the coaching staff to have that same idea. You don't want them to go up to Nedeljkovic and say like, hey, we're going to get completely crushed here tonight, and so we don't want Askarov playing, and we're going to put you in between the pipes instead. Like, they want to go with their best goaltender. They want to go with the goalie who gives them a chance of actually winning, and imagine the confidence that could have been built for this group had the Sharks snuck out a victory here against the best team in the NHL. It would have been pretty crazy. So I have no problems with them going with Askarov. Obviously, doesn't really end up working out for them, not because of anything Askarov did, just the team as a whole just got absolutely destroyed, like I've mentioned multiple times. Askarov, in fact, actually was the Sharks' best player, I would say, in the first period. Yes, he lets in 2 goals, but he probably, like with average goaltending, you're probably letting in at least 3 or 4 otherwise. In the second period, he struggled a little bit more. That goal from Malinsky is definitely one he would want back. It's from pretty far out, not much traffic in front. And then the Josh Manson goal, this is with a ton of traffic in front. And at that point, the Sharks kind of pull the plug on the situation. They put Askarov out of his misery and get him out, put Nedeljkovic in. I think this is a smart move. You don't want Askarov giving up like 7 or 8 goals for absolutely no reason. Nedeljkovic comes in, immediately lets in a goal, then settles in more, actually makes some pretty good saves. So it showcases that the Sharks, their goaltenders were very far from being at fault for this loss here tonight, and it shows that they still have 2 pretty good, reliable goaltenders. So the Sharks, as I said, they play again on Friday, but they also have a game after that on Saturday. We'll see both of them get the start. It'll be interesting to see which is which. The Sharks play against Vancouver and Vegas. Obviously, those 2 teams are in pretty different positions at this point, so I imagine Askarov gets the one in Vegas and Nedeljkovic gets the one in Vancouver, but we'll see how it plays out. But that will do it for this review. As I said, Sharks back in action on Friday after Thanksgiving against the Vancouver Canucks, a team that should be a much more interesting matchup, a team that is much more at the San Jose Sharks level, and we'll see how they do then. Class dismissed.